Hey folks, I'm back with another Draw Steel interview for you guys. This one is a fun conversation I had with Dael Kingsmill of the Monarchs Factory. We talked about mythology and her experience playing in Dusk. We got into how her style of role-playing can sometimes conflict with Matt Colville's philosophy, and now probably the philosophy behind Draw Steel. Before we roll the interview, though, I want to thank everyone who expressed their support for this interview series. I'm excited to make many more this year. I've decided to name the series Insight Check. It'll be my avenue for having interesting discussions on tabletop RPGs. So if you are interested in that, subscribe. If this is the first of my interviews you've clicked, they are a podcast-style, audio-only interview. There won't be anything on your screen to see besides what you are seeing right now, so feel free to put this on while you commute or run on the treadmill. Alright, let's roll the interview. Alright, we are joined now by our guest, Dael Kingsmill. Dael is a popular YouTuber. Her channel is Monarchs Factory. She got her start over 10 years ago when she was selected for Geek and Sundry's vlog channel. There she produced a bi-weekly segment on mythology, and her insightful digestible videos on mythology continued on her own channel for years before she also started making Dungeons & Dragons content, which of course also became quite popular. Besides those things on YouTube, she was a writer, actor, director, and producer on the web series Wolfgang. She's also been a generous collaborator, contributing to really too many projects and in too many roles for me to neatly summarize, although I do have to at least mention her ongoing work as co-host of the Eldritch Lorecast, one of the top D&D podcasts that isn't an actual play. Of course, actual plays tend to dominate for views. But she's no stranger to actual plays either, since she was a regular on MCDM's D&D 4th edition actual play broadcast Dusk. Since Dusk, Dael has produced and appeared in many MCDM videos, in particular hosting the monthly Patreon Q&A videos on Draw Steel. So Dael, welcome.
My goodness, you've done your research. Woo.
Yeah, well, you have an impressive resume.
Certainly a long resume at this point. It's an interesting thing being sort of a YouTube free agent for this long, I suppose.
Honestly, the research was really fun to do. I particularly enjoyed Wolfgang. In fact, I was just finishing an episode before I called you, so that was awesome.
Oh, I love to hear it. Wolfgang is one of those things that it's like, I look at it and I see all of its imperfections and I see all of the ways in which it's kind of, crummy because it was basically just me and a couple of friends. Like, we had no crew. It was all just us and a camera. But even with all of those imperfections, I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of putting it together and getting it done.
It's definitely a step up from the things that YouTubers are typically doing. I can't imagine all the hats you had to wear to get a production like that completed.
Yeah. We don't all have Mr. Beast money.
So, my plan for the interview, and I say my plan because who knows where we'll go, but I would like to talk about mythology and Draw Steel and your experiences in Dusk, because just speaking for myself, I really want to explore an evocative mythological style of writing and design in my own products I make using Draw Steel system, and I'm certain that I could learn a lot from your insight into mythology, but also your experience kind of playing in, Matt Colville's games. You're kind of experiencing the proto Draw Steel setting, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Oh, man, I miss Dusk. I want to play more Dusk. We have to kidnap Justice and make everyone play again.
That'd be awesome.
Come on. I want more. There was that vision of, I was about to say a major spoiler for Dusk, I suppose. I suppose I will keep mum on the spoiler.
Okay. Yeah, well, if
I'm just saying,
folks watching this haven't watched Dusk, I do recommend it. Although I think, Dael, you're the one who says you should probably start at episode 3. Is that what you recommend?
Yeah, I think episode 3 is where I would pitch it, because episode 1 we've got our sort of finding each other's characters, figuring out who each other is, kind of it's very sea legsy, and then episode 2 is a fine place to start. I don't know. I just think episode 3 is where it starts feeling like Dusk rather than being sort of the experiment it originally was meant to be, if that makes sense. Because
Yeah,
it
makes
really
sense.
was. Matt was just, hey, I want to show off this virtual tabletop, and also I want to talk about 4th edition. Do you guys want to play? And we were like, hell yeah, let's jump in. And it was going to be like 2 or 3 sessions was the original pitch. And then we just got into it and it just kept going. And I think episode 3 was the turning point where it was like, ooh, there is something deeper, deeper in the woods. Ooh, the depths of the woad.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk to you about all of that stuff. But before we get into that, I was thinking we could take a minute or two to self-indulgently talk about our childhoods. And listen, if you're not interested, that is fine. But this might surprise you given the way I speak. But I'm pretty sure from my research, you and I grew up at roughly the same time and at roughly the same place. Only I left Australia in 2007, summer of 2007. Yeah.
This is wild.
I mean, so I always
Wow.
tell people I lived in Australia because they don't know where I actually lived. And I've never said this publicly, but I grew up, I moved in the early 2000s to the former Australian colony, Papua New Guinea. And that's where I spent most of my childhood. So I didn't actually
Wow.
grow up in Australia, but I went to an Australian curriculum school. I had Australian teachers, and we watched a
Yeah.
lot of Australian television. And then when
Also, I mean, this is a bizarre reach as well, but anytime I'm playing GeoGuessr and a place looks like Australia, I have to pause and think, could it be Papua New
could it be
Guinea?
Papua New Guinea? Yeah, yeah. My understanding, I haven't traveled around Australia very much. A little bit in Cairns and Brisbane, but Cairns and
Wow, wow,
Brisbane at
wow.
least seemed very similar in the environment to where I grew up. But
Oh, yeah. From what I know, from what I've seen, yeah, absolutely. Wow. How bizarre. And you got the Aussie TV as well. Were you getting like
Yes.
ABC?
you know, I can't remember the channel we got. Although some of the commercials are branded into my memory, like old commercials for Home and Away and McLeod's Daughters. I haven't
Closer each day.
exactly. Yeah, I haven't heard that in so long. But I can't reference it to my friends anymore. Every time I mention somebody like who to them is an impossibly obscure figure, like Ricky Ponting or
Oh, yeah.
cricket players, rugby players,
Yeah.
Darren Lockyer. They start to get really mad. My friends do these days, and they will call me Percy Shelley. That's their. You're gonna hate this.
That's really funny.
Because Ozymandias, so yeah,
That's so
those-
stupid. I love it. You are my kinsman.
so you used to do an old segment called Memory Lane where you would let prompts from your audience inspire stories of you and your friends to talk about your childhood. So I wonder if I could give you one prompt about something from my childhood that might spark
Oh,
something
please
for
do.
you. Okay.
Memory lane.
Now, this is actually, it's not really, it's a list. I'll start with the list, and you can stop me when you know where I'm going, or if you know where I'm going with it, all right? Okay, here we go. Diamond, emerald, lapis lazuli, topaz.
Deltora Quest. Sorry, that was a strong reaction.
So you read those.
Oh boy, did I read those. I loved those books. Oh my goodness. But I also think of, because I was a big reader as a kid, and as I got older, less so. I do think the ADHD that I only quite recently got diagnosed with had something to do with it. But but no, when I was reading, Emily Rodda is just the OG. She's so good. Because Deltora Quest, but not only that, lest we forget that she had a little duo of books, Finders Keepers, that I reference all the time.
Oh, I
and
never read
the Rowan
those.
of Rin series.
Yeah, I did read
if
Rowan
you
of
can-
Rin. I didn't read Finders
Yeah.
Keepers.
Yeah, Rowan of Rin was, again, in the sort of fantasy. For the folks who don't know, Deltora Quest is like such good intro to fantasy for kids. And I mean, I think of that, and I know that when I was reading the second book, I was so scared at one point early in the book that I put the book down and I didn't read it again for a year.
Which one was the second book?
I'm trying to think right now. I think it was. I want to say it was Ruby.
Well, I'll look
I
it
think
up.
it was the one that ended with the big fish. The big.
Oh,
scary fish.
yeah. That was freaky.
Yeah.
The kind of eel fish
But
thing.
it was the. Yes. And it was the part that scared me was those two people. They were like brother and sister, maybe, or they I don't know. They were freaky people, and they lived in like this weird little swamp. But it was like it looked like a very pristine, lovely house, but actually, it was what was it? There was like a thing that you had to read in reverse, and when you read it in reverse, it was like evil lives here.
Right. Yeah,
like that.
It's sparking memory. It's been so long for me, but yeah.
Oh, yeah. But it really freaked me out. And then Rowan of Rin, for people who are unfamiliar, is a little bit older fantasy. Like, it's more like sort of, I guess, teenage, maybe, in terms of the fantasy that it's targeting. But solid stuff. Really loved Rowan of Rin. And then Finders Keepers is not fantasy. It's not fantasy. But it's like modern day, sort of kid finds a portal into another world. But the thing that I always think about, so the thing from Finders Keepers that comes up all the time is the idea that when you've lost something and you look everywhere for it and it is nowhere, and then you end up finding it somewhere you've already looked, that's because things fall through to the other side of the barrier. And there are like patrolmen on the other side of the barrier who walk along and throw things back through. And so it's like it was genuinely gone, but then they threw it back, and so it landed back where you've already looked. I don't remember much of what the actual plot was, but I remember enjoying it, and I still reference the barrier to this day.
Yeah, for me it was book 1. There was this knight on the cover, a no longer human knight, you could say, and they find him in this forest. And I think that, like, image, the evocative image of the knight of the forest has stuck with me for so long. I include it in a lot of my adventures and in my writing. And, when I was reading Matt Colville's Priest book, it kind of reminded me of that. He's going into the woad and finding this ancient order of knights. And, I've always vibed with that one.
I gasped so hard when I realized what you were spelling. That was...
Yeah, those were... I actually ordered those from a Scholastic magazine that we would get sent from Australia. I don't know. Did you have those?
Oh, hell yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And I only quite rarely actually got something from the Scholastic magazine. But it was very exciting whenever you got to order something from the Scholastic magazine. Or did you do the book fairs as well, the Scholastic book fairs?
I don't think we had fairs. No, I don't remember anything like that. Where I was, we don't have a lot of access to books. But the Scholastic magazines that we would get sent through this Australian educational organization would send them. That was a way you could order books. So every time we got those, me and all my friends ordered something, sometimes 2 things. That was like the pipeline for us to get new things.
Yeah. Scholastic magazine was like Christmas shopping for yourself. Mm-hmm. It was so exciting, flipping through and just looking at all of the options.
Were you a secret code word spy book person, or like a Pokemon, or all of the above?
Now that you mention it, I was kind of a secret spy book type. I mean, I liked kind of a range of different things, particularly when I was young. Like I would get sciencey books. Like I remember being fascinated by this book of like deep sea creatures, which is wild because as an adult, I hate the deep ocean. I could barely watch Finding Nemo because the drop off freaks me out. So I don't know if that was a different time, a different person. But also, I would get these fantasy books like we were talking about, or I don't know. I was also definitely big on sort of puzzle riddle books where it was like, even the picture based ones where it was sort of like, you have to figure out the sort of visual riddle to solve your way out of this visual puzzle. I don't know. Or maze books, those sorts of things. Yeah, I was very into puzzle solving books as well.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the deep sea creatures, that's something I am still fascinated about today. And I've always wondered if living near the ocean and actually being in the sea. So I'm like you. I am terrified of the ocean, especially the deep ocean. It is truly like a Lovecraftian horror place. But when I'm safe in my house, I like to read about like deep sea cryptids or watch videos about them, like what could be down there. Because yeah, it's such a scary mystery.
Yeah, I wonder if I'm almost the opposite. Like if I'm at the beach, I'm fine, I'm chill, I'm not worried about it. I don't know, recently I was at the beach and I saw a stingray and was the only person in the vicinity to not be freaked out by the stingray. But no, when I'm at home, I'm like, I don't want to acknowledge the ocean. Please don't make me think of the ocean. Yeah.
Fascinating. All right, well, I could talk about growing up in Australia in the 2000s all day, but we should probably move on to Draw Steel.
Yeah. Something a little bit more relatable.
Yeah, for the audience. Sure. Well, actually, I guess kind of connected to that. So, how should I frame this? I guess I'll just ask the question straight. Your love of mythology and folklore and all that, I've always wondered, is Australia the kind of place in the world that's still magical? Do you know what I mean by that?
I feel like I know what you mean by that. And I feel like this is a conversation that I have sometimes. My mum wrote her doctoral thesis on fantasy as a genre and various elements of that. And in her studies, she talked a lot about Lewis's concept of northernness, right? That idea that there is a very specific, particular vibe. He talked about it, I think, in regards to Siegfried and the Twilight of the Gods. He heard that phrase. And he talks about being swept up into these northern skies and this feeling of like sweetness, but also melancholy because you can't stay in this place. And sort of this, I don't know, very beautiful, sweet, slightly painful concept that C.S. Lewis tied in with fantasy. And the way that sort of fits into broader fantasy as a genre is something that my mum has often talked about. The idea that fantasy is tied inherently to a northernness. In some aspects, the difference between sort of Norse mythology and what gets categorized as like southern mythology, so Roman, Greek,
right.
Sort of Mediterranean, the sort of languid nature of Mediterranean mythologies versus this sort of rugged northernness that you get in Norse and fantasy as an offshoot of that. But I personally have always felt like there is something else that exists within this southern space that is different. It is definitely different as a vibe, and it feels drastically so at times. Mm-hmm. But I think there is something there. And I mean, for me, there's a massive distinction to be made between magic and mythology, and also, any of fable versus fairy tale versus mythology versus religion versus culture versus, all these things have their sort of discrete differences that can be very hard to pin down, but I do think that they're there. So when I say that I think that Australia is magical, I'm not talking about like the dreaming. Like that is a whole separate cultural thing. But there is still something to me when I just look at this landscape. You know what it kind of vibes like? It's there's an artist called Sydney Long who came to Australia, and when a lot of artists, like visual artists, came to Australia and tried to paint the landscape, it was really difficult for them because the trees are so different, right? Like,
yeah.
Like you're in Britain and trees look like trees, and then you come to Australia and they are these tall, enormous, like impossibly tall, long, skinny, white, ghostly things. They're the wrong color, they're the wrong shape, they're the wrong size. They're and so all these artists kind of struggled in a way because they were wrestling with something that I think a lot of visual artists wrestle with just sort of as they grow, which is that you have an image in your head of what something should look like, but the reality of what you're seeing can be very different to that. Whereas Sydney Long came in and he started painting what was there, what he was seeing. So you've got these bizarre skinny trees, this weird these alien landscape, and he would put into it some very really Mediterranean mythological figure. Like he would paint fawns into the landscape,
Right,
and he
yeah.
would have dryads, and then it slowly sort of becomes as well. He would start painting, no, this is a spirit of the plains of Australia, and so it would become less dryad. It would become more about the birds that are here and the things that are here. And then, I mean, you've got ones that are not fantastical as well, but feel a little bit magical still. There's a painting of his called An Incident in the Bush, which is literally just, it's a painting of a human skull and like 3 magpies in a kookaburra standing around the skull. And just by giving it that title, it evokes this thing of like, it's almost like they're having a meeting. They've congregated to talk about this thing that's happened, and we don't get to know what's happened, but there's kind of this smoky haze in the background. You wonder if there's been a bushfire. Like I don't know, it all becomes kind of this magical thing. I don't know.
Yeah. My memories of Papua New Guinea were of a place that felt more magical. And of course, I never experienced anything that I think anyone would describe as supernatural, but there was more like a vibe from living there that was, I felt closer to fairy tales than when I left. And yeah, I wasn't sure if that was just a Papua New Guinea thing or if it was all of Australia, but I've been trying really hard in my Dungeons and Dragons games or my Draw Steel games or in my fiction writing to get back to that feeling. And the more and more I tried, the more and more I found myself kind of working in the genre of mythology and folklore. Like, for some reason, that's the closest I can get to it. Yeah, the skull in the bush, what that reminds me of is, in Australia, do you guys have skull caves?
What is a skull cave?
I guess you don't. In Papua New Guinea, or at least my area, there's this phenomena called skull caves. Someday National Geographic's going to find out about it, and it's going to be, all over every Discovery Channel or whatever. But for now, I think they're mostly unstudied, and I got to visit lots of them just because we knew folks there. But they're caves and mountains that are stacked, massive stacks of human skulls.
Whoa.
And they're ancient skulls. No one knows how old they are because, as far as I know, they haven't been studied. Maybe they have been since I left. According to the locals, this is a vague memory. This is my understanding, but the old burial practice used to be that you would bury your dead standing up, like length vertical in the ground, up to their neck, and then you would cover the head of the corpse with a clay pot. And you would leave it for a while, and eventually the body would decay, and then you would take off the clay pot, and the skull would be there, and you would take the skull and you would stack it in the cave with all the other skulls, and it was a place for your ancestors, I guess. Wow. But yeah, that image has always stuck with me. We would go, hike way into the jungle, and you just go into some nondescript cave, and there would be hundreds of human skulls going back generations, presumably. Yeah. Anyways, that just sparked that memory.
That's so interesting. That makes me think of at some point, it was like a throwaway comment during Dusk, where I don't know how we got onto the subject, but Matt just asked, I don't know, what do elves do with their dead?
Yeah, that was so
and Anna and I were like, we don't know. But he would do that. He would just throw out that question, like, about any number of things. He would just throw out a cultural question about these different fantasy races and be like, I don't know, you're the one playing an elf. You tell me. And I remember pondering on it for ages. And I don't know what Matt's opinion is, because it's, he probably has slightly more of an opinion now that they've started actually writing and working on Draw Steel. Mm-hmm. But at the time, I remember sort of thinking about it a lot and coming back and saying, I think they probably find hollow trees and put the bodies of elves inside the hollow tree. And I think it would be cool if wood elves, at least, instead of rotting, petrify like wood. Mm-hmm. Like they just slowly harden and become basically rock.
Right.
But this idea that they like put them in hollow trees and let them become part of nature, and it's like this whole thing. But I don't know. I think it's just fascinating that idea that what is honorable is so different across different cultures.
Right.
You know, it's like there's a great this is a leap. There's a great zombie TV show called Kingdom, but it's South Korean and it's set during the Joseon period. So it's sort of just after a big war they had with Japan, but guns are brand new. There's only like one gun in the show. But it's this fascinating period of history to set a zombie show. And then it's also got that added thing that we're coming at it from an outside lens. And so, you know, there's all these different elements to it. But one of the things that stood out is that they need to burn the zombies to stop them from, you know, coming back to life. But no one wants to burn the bodies because that is culturally abhorrent. That's not how we should be getting rid of our dead. And so there's like this big pushback from a lot of people who don't want to burn the bodies of their dead, while these other people are going, they will come back to life and kill us all. And that was just really, I don't know, fascinating. It's one of the questions that I think of first when I'm doing world building stuff and I'm sort of setting up a city or something. I think, how do they dispose of their dead? Where are they putting their dead people? You know, is it catacombs? Is it a cemetery? Is it, you know, is it on the side of the hill facing the sunrise? Is it like what do they believe about death? I think becomes a very key kind of way to understand even fictional cultures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I also remember a point in Dusk where you guys had just rescued the human, you know, travelers, and they were being attacked by goblins, and you waited, and one of them died, and so after the fight they had to bury the person who died. And yeah, you and Anna got to roleplay this experience of what is it like for an elf to witness human burial practices. Yeah, you played it like you were almost offended at the idea of burying someone. Like, it wasn't just bizarre, it was gross to you.
Because it was, it felt like it. I'm vaguely remembering this. I could be remembering it wrong. Someone will have watched it more recently and will correct me. My memory of it was that it was kind of like, at least for Lovelis, I think, it reflected this kind of this awful element of human culture from her perspective of like plowing fields and planting seeds. Because Lovelis is sort of woad elf through and through. She's like,
right,
the world is already providing what you need. Why are you doing these things? Mm-hmm. But in an angry way. It's like you are tearing up the world. You are building things. You're doing, and it's all terrible. Like she's very much. I think of her as sort of embodying sort of the retribution of nature, right? Like at least as she comes into the beginning of Dusk, I think she thinks of herself as, you know, like the renewing wildfire.
Right.
And then to see them do this with their dead at the site of one of these sacred trees that she didn't know was going to be here. And it's just like, for her, it's like, oh, this is a connection to my gods, the heroes of my past. And because she's an invoker, it's like this very intense thing. And then they're like, we're going to dig up the ground and put a dead guy in it.
Right.
And then it was just like, oh, you're plowing fields again. Yeah, it was that kind of reaction. But then her having to sort of recognize the pain and emotion that was there as well and try to, I don't know, meter her reaction.
I didn't make that connection between the idea of planting a seed. Maybe the natural way for a seed to grow is just to fall on the ground. But if you're specifically digging up the earth to plant it, that's more like farming. It's more like agriculture. And that brings up something I do want to talk about, playing into the themes of Matt's setting, which have now become kind of the themes of maybe the whole system of Draw Steel. But before we get to that, still just on the subject of mythology, one of the things I found so fascinating about you playing Lovelis in Dusk, and also you playing in Matt's game, is looking back on it now, it seems to me like there was a clash in styles. Of course, you guys did not actually clash, but as I've learned more about the way you think about games and the way Matt thinks about games from your respective content, you have this kind of motto of vague and evocative, which you use a lot, right? And Matt is especially now adopting this motto of imagine things complexly. And it strikes me that these two things are in conflict, right? Because, I mean, just quite simply, like, vague is the opposite of complex, right?
Yeah.
And there's definitely something very realpolitik about the way Matt likes to build a world. And when I think of mythology, so maybe this is where I'm ignorant, but when I think of mythology, I think of something much more vague and evocative. Especially something I really like about mythology is I find that characters tend to represent ideas. They tend to be abstract principles. So a hero is a virtue. And in a story, he's supposed to represent that virtue. And he's telling you about something about human nature, what they saw as universal human nature. I don't see mythology as a realistic and complex portrayal of the world as it really is. It's more like an exploration of oneself. So what do you think about that? Am I onto something here, or is there really no conflict at all?
So, okay, well, first of all, I think it's really funny that you picked up the sort of, I don't know, juxtaposition of our styles, because the way I remember it going is that I used a phrase similar to vague and evocative in a video for the first time. And about a week later, I was watching a Colville live stream where he happened to say that something was stupid because it was too vague and too, just the vibiness of it all. Right. And I remember being in chat and going, whoa, 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 whoa. Hey, I feel like that's my entire brand. And then it came up a third time, and it did kind of become my D&D brand, right? It's right. Vague and evocative, that's Dael. And now he'll use that at me. He'll throw that at me. Like yesterday, he sent me a message where he was sort of teasing a concept, and he went, it's vague, but is it evocative? Like, he'll just throw that in my direction.
Right.
And I do think that that's very funny. But I think you're right. But dare I say, I think when it comes to mythology, it is both complex and vague.
Interesting.
Because,
all right.
So I would argue that, so particularly if we look at Greek mythology, which is, my area of best knowledge, and also, one of the mythologies that we have the most kind of, I won't say complete, but well-rounded understanding of and collection of, because it happened to get lucky and sort of get swept along in the dominance of what we now call Western culture, and so didn't get destroyed like so many other mythologies, was not actively destroyed. I often hear people say that mythology is moralistic, it's teaching you a moral, and I would kind of disagree with that. I think you are closer to what it is, where it's more that it shows us, it gives us insight in what to that culture valued. Mm-hmm. And what they condemned. I like to think about if you talk about the story of the sacred deer, right? So throughout mythology, the Greek mythology, there are all these different stories wherein someone has pissed off a god. Wait, what's the rules on swearing? Someone's ticked off a god. Someone's ticked off a god. The god demands in return a sacrifice. They say you have to sacrifice your child. And this is true of other mythologies as well. It happens in, Judeo-Christian mythology. It happens in other places. But you see this constant through line of having to walk a line of being willing to go through on that sacrifice and kill your own child for the gods. Mm-hmm. Because that is something that the culture valued, is that devotion to the gods and that unquestioning loyalty to the gods. But also, these cultures were so deeply against the idea of killing your own child, of infanticide, there we go, but specifically of your own baby. And so you end up with all these stories. It happens in the story of the Golden Ram. It happens in various stories of war, any number of times that they would be asked to sacrifice their own child in order to win the war, but the daughter will say, I don't want them to have to do that. So the daughter flings herself from the parapet. So you get the sacrifice, but the father didn't have to do it. Or in the story of the Golden Ram, he goes to go through with it, but the Golden Ram flies in and saves the kids at the last minute, right? There's something that there's, I mean, a Deus Ex Machina that doesn't necessarily come from the gods of they were willing to, but they didn't go through with it. Mm-hmm. So the story of the sacred deer is fascinating because this happens just before the Trojan War, where various soldiers in Agamemnon's army have killed and eaten a deer that was sacred to Artemis, and so the gods go, "No, you're not allowed to sail to Troy until you have sacrificed your child to sort of make up for this horrible crime of killing the deer." And so Agamemnon invites his wife, Clytemnestra, I believe, and his youngest daughter to the camp that they've made and says, "Oh, she's going to marry Achilles, who's, hot stuff. He's everyone's favorite dude." Mm-hmm. And so they're like, "Oh, wow, this is good. Let's go. Let's have a wedding." And when she gets there, Agamemnon kills his daughter. He actually does it. He goes through with it. And
yep.
They get the blessing. They can sail off to Troy and they can fight. But that marks their family for literally generations, because when Agamemnon gets back, his wife has been stewing in the background this whole time that he's been at war. And she's taken a lover, and when Agamemnon gets back, they murder him. Okay, sure. So now they've murdered him, but there is this rule of familial loyalty that is the through line through this whole thing. Now they're kids, Electra and whatever the son's name is,
I don't know. I'm sorry.
His name starts with O.
That's close enough.
Somewhere. Yeah, Electra and the other guy, they are bound by familial law, by this deep cultural law, to get revenge on the one who killed their father. But that's their mother. So they get revenge on their mother, but now they have killed their mother. And that's still within that same thing. So now they have to, it becomes this ongoing thing where over and over again, their family is cursed by this huge cultural slight. And it, goes all the way through until someone has to get cleansed at some temple. I don't know. We're very late in the timeline of Greek mythology. Things start to get hazy, but it is just sort of this glimpse at, like, what does this culture value? What do these characters represent when they transgress those boundaries? And Greek mythology constantly, they set up these heroes who live up to the ideals of everything that the culture valued. But then also, in the end, inevitably almost, they end up transgressing those boundaries and being punished. And it serves as kind of this this microcosm. And I still don't think of it as moralistic in the way. I don't think it's trying to teach you a lesson. I think it is more just expressing tragedy and that complete spectrum of values and the ways in which mortal, even demigod figures will fall short of this divine set of values, I suppose.
Sure. Interesting. Yeah, I guess I had just said I thought mythology was, to use your word, moralistic. Although I probably wouldn't call it moralistic. Although I think it was trying to teach you a lesson more about human nature.
A slightly different thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, not rather than, it's not the fairy tale sort of style, even fairy tales, but that style of, and that is why you should brush your teeth.
Sure,
it's not
yeah.
moralistic in that sense, but it does teach you things.
Well, I think so. Let me just say right off the bat, I have not studied mythology. It's just I'm an enthusiastic amateur reader of myths, but
that's
I definitely
how I would classify myself. That's
really?
I think
that's humble of you.
I don't know. It's not like I never studied classics at university.
Sure.
I got in over my head, I think, with the sources I was consulting.
Fair enough. Well, that aside, what I find I do is I'll find a piece of mythology that I really like, and I will reread that. So I have a lot of knowledge about that thing, but not mythology broadly. So I know very little about Greek mythology, to be honest. But, I did read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and I read it in undergrad, and I loved it, and I reread it often. So that story really resonates with me. Have you read the Wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell? Is it a 13th century knight's tale?
I don't think I've read that one.
I really love that one, but like when I read Mallory, I can't get through it. I find for some reason Mallory just doesn't resonate with me. But so yeah, all that's just background info. But so the Wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell is a good example of what I want to say here, which it seems to me pretty clearly to be a story aimed at children, and I would classify it as vaguely mythological. It's a story aimed at children. I think probably young men. Like, I haven't read this from a scholar. This is just my feeling, someone who's read the story many times. So the character of Sir Gawain in the story isn't really a character in the Matt Colville sense of having a complex personality and being a person, right? He's more an idea. He's supposed to represent their ideal of masculinity. And so the story is supposed to be a fun and funny way. It's something that starts out fun and funny for young men, but sneaks a lesson in there is what I think's happening. And it's something like, okay, so this is another weird take. Sorry if I'm going off on a tangent here, but did you watch the old Amazing Spider-Man series? Not the one with Tobey Maguire, but the other ones. There's been so many.
The middle one.
Yes. Garfield.
He has a name. Garfield. Andrew Garfield.
Andrew Garfield. Right. So
yes, I did.
Those weren't great, but somebody working on those movies, they were fine, sure. Someone on those movies had an insight, I think, because they kept putting in this reoccurring scene where Spider-Man would be trying to rescue a child, and the child was paralyzed with fear. And what he would do is he would take off his mask and give it to the child. And then when the child put the mask on, they suddenly had the courage to do what they needed to do, like grab his hand or get out of the way or run for it or something like that. And so to me, very obviously, this is a metaphor of like what Gawain and Dame Ragnell is doing, which it's the children are supposed to put on the mask of Sir Gawain and imagine themselves as him, and that's like instructs them to live their life. And I think of mythology as doing that a lot, but that's specifically the mythology, I guess, that's aimed at children, right? Like the Iliad isn't. It's a little more complex in that way, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and you end up with such, like this is, I mean, I touched on it briefly before, these very fine, difficult to describe differences between a lot of clearly related texts.
Right.
Where it's like, you know, mythology that borders on history, mythology that is cultural folklore, mythology that is fables, mythology and they all kind of overlap in different places, but they feel different. That's the closest I can come to really explaining it, is just to say that when you read them, you sense that they are different from one another. It's hard beyond that to pin anything down, but I just think that the more that you read different mythologies from different places, different times, different contexts, any of that, the more that you can kind of, I don't know, sense out that difference. Like an octopus reaching for stuff. Like you're just like, there's something there.
Yeah. This might be romantic and naive, but I like to think that there's some kind of like interpersonal connection that you can have with the audience or not the audience, the author or the culture that authored it, just from some kind of like shared human experience, right? Like there's some metaphors and symbols that you can just understand because we do have some shared experience with these people, even though there's such a massive gulf in time and geography between us. But anyways, another example is I think of Gilgamesh as not a very three-dimensional character. I think he's supposed to represent something in us, the readers, which is a kind of drive for immortality. And so if you're playing a game of Draw Steel or Dungeons and Dragons or whatever game you prefer, and you want to kind of tap into this vague and evocative mythological type of storytelling, how do you make a character like Gawain or like a Gilgamesh, which is maybe not three-dimensional? Is that something worth doing, in your opinion, or am I just misunderstanding what these characters are?
It's difficult, isn't it? No, I think you're right. I think because I mean, they at least with Greek mythology, they often become slightly more complex towards the end of their stories, these heroes.
Interesting.
Just because a lot of the sources that we have for classical Greek and Roman mythology come from specifically competitions to write plays. We get some comedies, but a lot of what we get are the tragedies, which were often submitted as 3 parts. And so you want to have that really dramatic sort of catharsis evoking big finish for your character, right? So a lot of them, you have this sort of archetypal shape to them. I don't know, Oedipus, for example, you have this archetypal shape to them where it's like, yes, he is a fantastic hero. He is smart and he outwitted the Sphinx. And now he is king. And then the story goes, we're going to take a hard pivot. He found out a horrible, awful truth and gouged out his eyes. And then his final act, his third part in this sort of triptych, is him wandering the desert with his daughter and sort of having an internal reckoning with, you know, his own sort of hubris and what it means for him now. And he dies in exile, but it becomes this much more sort of introspective sort of final act. And often there is, even if it is a shorter final act, it's that sort of moment of realization and humbling that complexifies a lot of Greek heroes. But because that is something that comes up in that final, I don't know whether we can make these characters. You know, you'd have to come in very late in a character's story to play as them in this sort of complex space rather than an archetypal space. I do think it is really difficult to mesh the genres of at least classical mythology and D20 fantasy.
Right.
I think those are what's his name? There's an academic who writes about fuzzy sets and genre theory. And you know, every genre has this sort of horizon of expectations, they call it, of what you expect to encounter in that genre. And they do start to diverge in a big way. And I've talked about it a little bit before. You know, Tolkien kind of typifies the fantasy core. And the horizon of expectations includes things like specifically the eucatastrophe, where you think everything is lost, everything is terrible, there's no possible way that we could overcome this. And then this thrilling moment of joy as the tables are turned. And that's a reversal of fate, which is what, you know, Aristotle talks about within his writing on what makes tragedy.
Right.
But it's a reversal of fate in the opposite direction to what we tend to see in classical mythology. We tend to see someone riding high, they're king, everything's great, and then something happens, you find out you slept with your mum, time to gouge out your eyes. So that's the catastrophe that typifies tragedy, and in many ways typifies what we think of with classical mythology. And it just is so in opposition to the eucatastrophe of fantasy that it's really difficult to marry those and make it work. I don't know. Maybe you could do like an Achilles. I'm trying to think of characters that would work as like RPG characters. But I don't know. It's hard.
Yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. If I'm understanding you right. Yeah. So you're saying the genre of fantasy and the genre of mythology, they started similar, but they've diverged. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, I think they have a lot of overlapping elements within this fuzzy set. So to explain what a fuzzy set is, it's kind of the idea that there is no hard boundary of definition. So birds, right? What is
Yep.
a bird? And you start thinking about it as like, oh, it's a creature with wings, it flies, it has feathers. But then you start getting further out from that because you go, oh, but what about penguins? They have wings, they don't fly. Okay, they swim. Okay, that's weird. And then you start getting out towards chickens. You start getting, things like bats fall into the mix. You're like, okay, where does a bat sit in that definition of bird? Because we all kind of know it's not a bird, but really it kind of is in that outer boundary of what this fuzzy area of how we define things. And the same is true of genres. Like if we hold Tolkien as being close to the center of that set, you still get those fuzzy boundaries the further you go out. And I think fantasy sits on the fuzzy boundaries of mythology, and I think that mythology sits on the fuzzy boundaries of fantasy.
Interesting.
Who was it? It might have even been Tolkien who talked about fantasy as being, or maybe fairy stories specifically, as being stories of mortals on the border of the perilous realms, which I love that phrase. I love that phrase. And that idea of it's a person who is encountering these fey fantastic things and how they interact with them. And then you go to something like Norse mythology, or even any mythology really, and it often becomes the story of the divine interacting on the mortal world instead. It's Odin taking up the guise of the Grey Stranger and wandering in the mortal realms in Midgard. It's the gods from Olympus coming down and, enforcing their will on the mortal world. It's kind of the opposite direction. But they do sort of still, these definitions influence each other and sort of exist in each other's orbits.
So I have a lot of thoughts on that. I haven't thought about it the way that you're saying it. And I'm sure you're right, because I'm sure you've thought about this a lot more than I have. The way I
could have thought about it a lot and also be wrong. That's also true. That's
a lot
possible.
of people are, yeah. Let's just say you are more likely to be right than I am, I'm completely shooting from the hip here. But the impression I always got was, so, you hear people like Matt Colville and now just the broader D&D fantasy RPG sphere talk about two broad genres of game. You have the pulp fantasy, which, it's like Conan or Farfetch'd and the Grey Mouser. And then you have the epic fantasy, which is more like Tolkien or Game of Thrones or something like that. So I agree with that. But what seems to me completely missing is where fantasy started, at least my impression of where it started, which is like Dunsany. Are you familiar with Lord Dunsany?
It rings a bell, but not deeply familiar, no.
Ooh, you should really read Gods of Pagana. I think, I don't know you. I've just watched a lot of your content. I think you would be really into it. Lord Dunsany was a Irish writer who is...
It's a good start.
He first published in 1904, something like that. He's like in the generation of Tolkien and Lewis, but slightly predates them as far as publishing goes. And my understanding is considered one of the first modern fantasy writers. But his first work, Gods of Pagana, is just straight up a fictional mythology. The starting lines, it still sticks with me. Fate and chance cast lots to see whose the game would be, and the winner strides to Ayaman as Soche and says, "I've won the game." And then he launches into this really unique mythology that uses very... I
just got little goosebumps on my arms. That's fun.
I know. It's kind of like a fictional version of the Book of Genesis, and it's written in a very King James Version Bible style, which a lot of people find difficult to read, but I absolutely love. And many people feel like he inspired the Silmarillion. I've heard people say that, but as far as I know, we don't have any evidence that Tolkien read Dunsany, although he was extremely popular in Tolkien's time. So, but...
sounds plausible, definitely.
Anyways, so here's a guy. Okay, he writes mythology, he writes folklore, he writes fairy tales, and he inspires Lewis and Tolkien maybe. And that genre has just apparently not translated into fantasy. It seems like we've kind of ignored it. And yeah, maybe there's a good reason for that. Maybe it just doesn't gel, like with what you're trying to do in a game of Dungeons and Dragons. It's just so antithetical to what you're trying to do in writing a mythology that they can't mix. But I have an instinct that they mix, but who knows?
Somewhere, somehow.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about themes then. So to take you back, you were telling me about this decision that you made when you were playing Levelis in Dusk, about why she was offended with the humans' burials, and it's because it reminded her of a farm, of agriculture, right?
Yeah, well, it signals that arrogance, right? It signals that thing that she views as deeply human, that idea of, you know better than the world. You know better than nature. You enforce your will over nature instead of bending with it. She thinks it's inelegant. She thinks it's arrogant. Yeah, that sort of thing.
So to me, I mean, it sounds like you've built this character to engage pretty directly with the Matt Colville themes of a game, which is law and chaos, right? And for him, if I'm understanding it right, you will understand it much better, I'm sure. Law roughly represents civilization, and chaos roughly represents the wilds. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, well, that's my impression as well. To be fair, when we went to play this initial, 2 or 3 session sort of tester thing, I originally was going to play a human.
Okay.
And then I was going to play, on the table was human, and also on the table was rogue. And he was like, you've been a rogue before, you've been a human before, you're going to be an elf invoker. And I was like, all right, I'll be an elf invoker. But as a result, like, I didn't know that much. So there was a lot, like, you go to the early part of that chat where we were making characters and things, and it's just a lot of us asking questions and him dumping stuff from his documents. It's like, this is everything I know about Woad Elves. Yeah, my understanding of lore and chaos is pretty similar to yours, I would say.
Yeah, so this is something I've been thinking about a lot. I've been asking people. I got to ask Jordy about this when I interviewed him. Is this question I have of where the themes are in a game of Dungeons and Dragons or Draw Steel or any D20 system. It seems like Draw Steel has themes of the system, and they are the kind of law and chaos themes that Matt loves to explore. But it seems to me a little bit weird that a system would have themes in it. It seems like themes would belong to the game, and the game is something that, at least the way I think about it, Draw Steel isn't the game. The game is what the director does with Draw Steel and what the players do with Draw Steel at the table. So maybe that's where the themes happen. Or maybe it happens at the level of characters, like should your characters have themes? And all of the above. I wonder if you have any insight into that.
Right. I don't know if I have like good insight. The first thing I think of is that, the medium is the message, right? I always struggle to find like a good example of I can't speak for Marshall McLuhan, but when I'm saying the medium is the message, I'm talking about like, I don't know, like a lecture hall says something. If there's a space for someone to stand at a lectern at the front, and then all these chairs that are tiered like an amphitheater looking down at that one person, that says something. It sends a message. And I think it's very, very difficult to escape the inherent meaning in any structure, in anything that we do. A building will tell you something about its purpose just by the architecture. And I think that the game system, in a similar way, it may be less obvious, and I can't like give you direct examples necessarily, but I think a game system inherently is going to tell you something about itself, just because it will be designed, if it's been designed with any finesse, it will be designed to encourage certain styles of play and discourage other certain styles of play. Through that, you start to get things that will mesh well with lore that you've also put in your book, and they will clash with other stuff. It's like 5e is not great for playing like Pokemon, if that's what you want to play. Right. Even if you strip out all of the lore, all of the flavor text, all of the names for things. Even sometimes I think people forget that the names for things become fluff text, become part of that flavor. But you strip all of that out, you get it just down to the numbers, and it still won't really do Pokemon.
Right.
As much as you put the Pokemon names on it, it still won't really do Pokemon.
I mean, that's a bad
and I think
example,
in that
because I do
sense-
have a really good Pokemon homebrew of 5e.
You have a really good Pokemon homebrew. How much homebrewing did you have to do? That's the question.
I'm just kidding. That would be terrible.
I mean, no. Look, I am on the record. You can look at my YouTube channel, and I will say things like 5e could do 80s teen horror for sure. Which you have to change things around in order to do it. But I think there is a way in which a game system, even if it can't, like, it doesn't preclude you from doing any number of other things with it that are different from what the game designer intended. You can sort of bash a system into doing what you want. But I think that a game system very quietly kind of influences you in the direction of flavor and lore, just because it was designed with intention. I don't know. That's I don't know whether I'll die on this hill later, but that's how I feel about it right now.
Sure, yeah. No, that makes sense to me, because, yeah, I mean, if we take 5e as an example, so it's a class-based system, right? That's obviously a system choice, but it seems like a class, especially one that's well-designed, has a kind of narrative thematic package to it, right? Like, that's something I've always thought, clerics or warlocks or paladins, these are classes which, when you pick them, you kind of know something about the themes of your character. Maybe others not so much. Like, yeah, fighter seems a little bit more vague, right? And the same thing with some of the ancestry choices, right? I mean, it depends on the game, of course. People do different things with ancestries.
Yeah, well, no, for sure. Because, I mean, if you look at if the way that 5e approaches spellcasters versus the way Draw Steel approaches spellcasters, and what they should feel like, and what playing them should evoke, because it's vague and evocative, it's drastically different from one another. There is a different intention behind those designs, and I think that you can feel that when you play them.
Yeah. I have many more questions, but I think we could probably wrap it up here. Is there anything you wanted to talk about?
Do you have like a favorite of the questions that you want to hit?
Oh, let me look here. A kind of angle I wanted to explore, or I just want to ask you about, I don't know why I keep using this word explore, but was how much mythology is connected to things that are more geographical or environmental. Because that was another thing I really liked about Levelis in your game. I mean, you were a woad elf, and you were kind of a disciple of nature. But yeah, I was impressed when I watched Dusk that it seemed like you had a kind of intuitive, natural type of thinking, which I don't have, but which reminded me of growing up in Papua New Guinea. These were the kind of stories that people would tell. They always seemed to me a little more aware of geography. Man, I'm not expressing this well, but do you understand what I'm getting at?
I do understand what you're getting at, and there is something that is, I don't even know how to describe it. I wonder how much of that is just the disconnect of being, a white person from the British colonies. You know what I mean? Where there is such a disconnect from place in a big way compared to, any number of indigenous cultures around the world. But one of the first things that comes to my mind is songlines. In Australia, we talk about, songlines. Different Aboriginal groups would have songs and stories that were so deeply tied to place that it enabled long distance travel. You know what it's this incredible sort of deep set cultural thing. And when I say indigenous cultures around the world, I'm including, like Welsh, like it is so significant, and so much of mythology as well. Any mythology, you go to the early stages and it is describing how the land was formed. How did these shapes happen? Whether it's the rainbow serpent, whether it's the giant's way, they're telling you this is how those mountains came to be. And I think that there is this deeply human kind of connection that the further we get into sort of an industrial, cultural, global mindset, the further we get from this this part of humanity that is just learning to work with the place you're in.
And that's where we ended this one. Thank you guys so much for listening. If you want to hear more interviews like this, subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.